Welcome to the BLUF, or the bottom line up front with the FBI AIA. I'm here with one of our members, Michael Coyne. So Mike, what's the BLUF for today?
So the bluff for today is I wrote a piece in April for the Cipher brief, and my two main points are first, that we need to understand counterintelligence through the lens of history, and knowing what we're doing now is very heavily informed by what we used to do. And second, the kinds of intelligence threats we now face are way bigger and complicated than the US government alone is designed to handle.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you so much for joining us today. So my name is Stanczyk, and I'm the COO of the FBI Association of Intelligence Analysts. And the AIA, we were actually formed in late 2021 by a small group of former FBI intelligence analysts who sought to build a wider community after they left government service to advance the careers of intelligence analysts, both in the private sector and in government and academia. We're here to really support and build the intelligence profession widely. And we do this through mentoring, networking, advocacy, and programming like today's event. So I was super excited. First, Mike was our first 2025 FBI AIA member to join. So after he left government, he joined the association. And when I read his Cipher brief article in April of this year, I was just like, we have to talk to Mike about this. This is incredible work. So if you haven't seen this article, it should be linked in the description here, in the description for this event. I highly encourage you to read it, because while we're going to be having a conversation about the article and Mike's insights and findings, we want to make sure that you get the full context for the depth of his research and analysis and just expertise. So speaking of his expertise, this is a really good time, Mike, if you want to give us your more formal introduction.
Where here's a formal introduction. And I will start by noting that as a former Federal Bureau of Investigation employee, I have been through the Office of Public Affairs to ensure that anything I say is appropriate and does not represent the official views of the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I am here on my own recognizance as a retiree. So I retired on New Year's Eve 2024. So I've been out for about 5.5 months now. I consider myself a career counterintelligence analyst. I started at the FBI as what would now be called a Presidential Management Fellow back in 1990. I had the opportunity to work in counterintelligence starting in 1992, and I loved it. I had a great career. I worked with a lot of really wonderful folks. I had some wonderful joint duty assignments. I spent a couple of years at what was then the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive. I came back. I got to be the Bureau's first senior national intelligence officer for counterintelligence. I spent 3 really hard but very informative years at the National Intelligence Council. This is Woody and I's think tank for the IC, and ended up my career as the acting National Intelligence Manager for counterintelligence at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. So it's a great, I've had a great career. And Sarah, thank you to you and the FBI AIA for having me come talk.
I'm just so thrilled. And for our audience and listeners, the NIM for CI is like the US government's authority for counterintelligence. So it's really an honor that you're one of our members and that you agreed to share your insights today. So I know that we've been talking a lot about counterintelligence, and that's what this session is about. But just to level set for our audience, what is counterintelligence?
That is a great question. I'm going to give 4 definitions. I'm going to start with my favorite one, which is a quote from Eric Ambler. Eric Ambler is now deceased, so he's not writing anymore, but he wrote British spies fiction from the 1920s to the 1970s. So you can think of him as an Ian Fleming predecessor. And he had this great quote from the novel The Light of Day, which is a heist novel. It's a lot of fun. It was got made into a movie called Takabi. I think that if I were asked to single out one specific group of men, one type, one category, as being the most suspicious, unbelieving, unreasonable, petty, inhuman, sadistic, double crossing set of bastards in any language, I would say without any hesitation, the people who run counter-espionage departments. I always like to start with that quote because it's just a lot of fun, even though obviously counter-espionage is a subset of counterintelligence. So I'm going to give you 3 quotes that are a little more practical. None are as fun as this. So Executive Order 12333 from 1981 defines counterintelligence as information gathered and activities conducted to identify, deceive, exploit, disrupt, or protect against espionage. This is a very active definition. It talks about taking efforts to counter. And there's also explicitly in the mention of 12333, there's an explicit mention of countering terrorism and sabotage, which is something that in the FBI's tradition, we have focused less on, sabotage more so now, but terrorism, not really. And if you take a look at the counterintelligence mission that the Department of Defense has and some of the force protection efforts in which they engage, really there is that countering terrorism aspect there considered as part of the counterintelligence mission. Informally, and this comes from a colleague, and I can't remember who told me this, but I thought it was a great definition. Informally, CI is identifying and neutralizing the activities of foreign intelligence services operating in this country, countering intelligence. Academic Walter Lacour, who is actually not he was an international relations academic, not a national security academic, but he had a really good short definition, in which counterintelligence is the detection and frustration of the activities of foreign agents, which really I often shorten to finding and stopping the bad guys, which is actually a lot what we do in the FBI, regardless of the program that people are in.
Great. That is really, really helpful. And I think there's a lot of application to the private sector now that, time permitting, we will try to dive into later. But to kind of elaborate a little bit on those definitions and your experience with counterintelligence, how does the field of intelligence and then operations play when it comes to, or interplay rather, when it comes to counterintelligence?
So from my perspective, and I spent really the first half of my career as an analyst working with investigators, operators, I think they're absolutely closely linked. The best and most rewarding work that I ever did as a counterintelligence analyst was supporting the FBI headquarters, supervisors, special agents, and then the field squads with my partner. So our job was to research everything that we could about the target, get really, really smart on it, get a sense of what made the adversary service tick, what were the individual motivations of the intelligence officers were here, how they were targeting, who they were targeting, and the kinds of things that they were going after. So our job was to be the knowledge base for in the lexicon of contemporary science fiction and other movies. We were the man in the chair. So we didn't actually have technical knowledge, but we did understand how the adversaries worked. We didn't know how to run a case. We didn't know really the legal requirements for proper investigation, but also philosophically why we would investigate and how we would try to get the answers that we needed for the best resolution of whatever the case was at hand. We picked that up over the course of time, but we didn't start knowing that stuff. Our job was to figure out, okay, so-and-so is the target. What is everything that we can tell our investigators so that they can do the best job? The investigators, they knew how to run the case. They knew how to get the investigative resources they needed, the bank records, what we would now call personally identifiable information, FISA where it was needed, any other investigative development of sources. They knew how to ask the right questions when they developed those sources, and they could identify to get to the suitable endpoint. My colleague and I gave them the context for all of the other stuff, so they didn't have to worry about country X. We could tell them everything they wanted to know about country X, but we couldn't tell them, here's how you recruit a source on country X. So there was a really very effective symbiotic relationship. And this is, I would say, parochially, well before the Bureau's massive expansion of its analytic ranks after September 11th. There weren't that many of us working in counterintelligence. I'd assert that most of the analysts in the Bureau before September 11th, well, the plurality, if not the majority, were working counterintelligence, in part because it was a really complicated thing with a lot of demand for headquarters supervision or oversight. And in a pre-internet, early internet time, the only way to get the answers was to do research from Washington. It was a lot harder to do if you were in Omaha in 1993.
That's great. And one thing that always strikes me when talking about intelligence analysts in the Bureau is they're exposed to a lot of different violations and programs worked, whether it be counterintelligence, counterterrorism, or others. And the fascinating thing is watching how the individual skill sets of each analyst evolve over time, and also more widely the capabilities of the intelligence program writ large, because there's so much diversity of work. And you find that, there will be an analyst that maybe grew up learning the trade craft when applying that to counterterrorism targets, and then transitions to a counterintelligence role and begins to apply different techniques and types of analysis from what they learned that maybe traditional counterintelligence analysts may not have been exposed to over the course of supporting the investigations that they did. So we kind of see this happen time and time again, and it just leads to a very robust, very diverse analytic skill set across the board that I always find very interesting. So I really love hearing about counterintelligence in the FBI, especially from the analyst perspective, because there are some very unique experiences and techniques that can be widely applied to other violations and other programs, including when analysts leave and go to other agencies or go to the private sector.
I had a
Yeah.
Well, to your very good point, Sarah. I had a boss one time. We were doing a lot of hiring in 1996 as we were expanding the domestic terrorism, international terrorism analytic ranks. And one of the questions that applicants would often have is what would make for a good analyst? And my boss at the time said it's somebody who really likes to solve puzzles. And at the heart of what we are as analysts is we can thrive in a world of ambiguity, and we like to get to the best possible answer we can. And it is that uh, picking a part of that puzzle, of breaking something down into its smaller pieces and trying to understand it, that really is very helpful, not only in counterintelligence, but in all of the other analytic disciplines of the FBI. And to your very good point, translates really well when it comes to, it's all about problem solving, right? And the output varies. Sometimes it's a briefing, sometimes it's you solve a question, sometimes it's you write a really good paper, but it's all about translating the unknown and making it visible. And that's something that the FBI has done, I think, has advanced in great leaps and bounds over the last certainly 3 decades.
Absolutely. And on that topic, past 3 decades, how has the counterintelligence field evolved from your perspective?
So I'd say probably there are 3 big ways, and lots more that I'm not going to list. I think the advent of the internet, the ubiquitous technical surveillance (UTS), and now AI has democratized how anybody, Uncle Sam, and adversaries can get and exploit information. We, the United States, used to have a dramatic lead over lots of different adversaries, and the that has changed. So when we were in the mid 1990s trying to figure out who our adversaries were in the aftermath of the Cold War, we fiddled around trying to figure out where was the best place to put our resources. But there was no question that our ability to collect, process, and exploit information was much better than that of our adversaries. And that is no longer the case. The technology that was used, developed in the aftermath of September 11th to help adversaries and the United States hunt terrorists is really useful for hunting spies, including our own collectors, and is really useful for finding our people and our efforts to collect against adversaries. So the advantage that we used to have is dramatically eroded. Second, the workforce, Uncle Sam's and that of our adversaries, is much more skilled in a digitally enabled world. And I'm really an analog guy. I'm kind of a guild approach. So it's like you go, you do a bunch of research in paper files, and you write an eloquent report that's 30 pages long, and then you hack it down to 5 pages. And rarely, where I had some successes was manipulating what was at that time vast amounts of data. So it'd be maybe looking at a couple hundred subjects or IOs or people in a source network to try to figure out how the adversary ticked. Well, now that scales to millions of records on a pretty regular basis, and that that shift from analog to all digital all the time is really quite stark. And then I think the third thing, less having to do with the nature of our adversaries, it's the nature of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about counterintelligence. So Bill Evanina, who had been the NCSE director, career FBI investigator, came up with a concept called that I don't think he uses this term, called expanded counterintelligence. So I was raised on the find the intelligence officer, find the source network, and find and stop the bad guys. And in expanded counterintelligence, what we're really looking at is not only finding the IO, not only finding the spy, but also countering foreign malign influence, or FMI, securing supply chain, protecting critical infrastructure, safeguarding national economic security, and a few other attendant things. And in these expanded CI topics, counterintelligence is not necessarily the main part of them. Arguably, FMI is very heavily a counterintelligence issue. But counterintelligence touches on all of these things. And we're not used to that environment where we have to figure out how to protect critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure is something that Uncle Sam, by and large, does not own. Most of the critical infrastructure in the United States of America is owned in the private sector or other levels in the federal government. So how do you deal with an audience where what you're trying to protect is not something that you own, and where the threat, be it counterintelligence or cyber or counterterrorism, can all look the same until the last minute. And you might not actually ever be able to do the attribution of who is behind something, because we see a lot of cyber enabling counterintelligence activity, and likely vice versa. So this melange of issues that we look at when we're talking about counterintelligence has made it really hard for very traditional counterintelligence folks to say, okay, I'm going to look at the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and I'm going to concentrate in this way. Well, you can't just concentrate on a service or an officer. You have to think about networked adversaries using government and non-government capabilities, and doing things that we would consider in the past we would not have considered counterintelligence, that now have a counterintelligence flavor.
Yeah, and that is, I think that is what we're seeing, especially in the cyber domain, but even in the criminal domain and joint ventures, and there's just a lot happening. And I think, to your point, the amount of data that we're dealing with now is just something that is just it's an opportunity, but it's as much of a challenge as it is an opportunity for those working in counterintelligence or those who are trying to secure their organizations, even outside of government, to contend with. So I wanted to briefly define an acronym that we've been using, IO. It is Intelligence Officer. So you will probably hear that word thrown around a lot in the counterintelligence space. I think all the other acronyms we have defined. But I wanted to turn over now to more of the work that you've been doing, Mike, that resulted in the article in the Cipher brief. So that piece is broken up into different eras. So the title of the piece is The Fourth Era for American Counterintelligence. So I wanted to kind of hear, era by era, your thought processes for that. So we're going to briefly focus on the first three. So are you able to walk us through the first three eras of American counterintelligence?
Sure. And my intent in writing the article was to look back as far as I reasonably could and try to figure out where are we now and how did we get here. So the first era, I consider the kickoff for what we now consider contemporary American counterintelligence to be an act of sabotage in 1916. There's this place called Black Tom Island, which doesn't exist anymore, in New York Harbor, and the United States, which was not yet in World War I, was storing a lot of munitions there, and Imperial German saboteurs blew it up because they did not want the materials to get to support the Allied effort in World War I. So the idea that you would have saboteurs from a foreign country operating in the United States was stunning, and it caused the United States to suddenly be aware that there were bad guys out there who wanted to do harm to us for direct and indirect reasons. So this first era is from 1916 to about 1940, and it's the realization that the United States is on the global stage. There's World War I, and there's the run up to World War II, and the world is very unsettled. It's a hostile place, and the United States has now not only become a great country inside its own borders, but really does have a global footprint that had evolved in the preceding decades. So in response to this awareness of adversaries' efforts to hurt the United States, the US did a couple of things focused on what I call the investigations and enforcement category. The Espionage Act of 1917, which is still the law that we use, became the law, became policy. And the idea that we would have counterintelligence, people use different terms at the time, but the idea that the FBI in particular, which was not that old at the time, having been founded only in 1908, would have a role in protecting this aspect of national security by investigating and arresting people who did bad things, that was new. And that was a dramatic change for how the United States looked at things. From 1940 to 1991, so really the longest period of this century or so of CI, century plus, is what I call bipolar strategic competition. So we had World War II, it was good guys versus bad guys, and Cold War, it was the United States and NATO in the West against the Soviet Union and Warsaw Treaty Organization. And this was a global struggle that was both hot in the case of World War II and cold in the case of the Cold War, where that emphasis on investigation enforcement was there. We, the FBI and other organizations, were trying to find the intelligence officers and spy networks that other countries were using and trying to safeguard our secrets, including, for instance, the nuclear bomb secrets of the Manhattan Project. But there was also, we added a couple other things. There were offensive operations. There's a great book by J.C. Masterman. Masterman's the surname. I'm pretty sure it's JC, called The Double Cross System over World War II. The United States and the United Kingdom in World War II developed a mechanism to seize the Nazi spies in the UK and give them bad information. So we ran deception operations. We ran what we would now consider double agent operations. And it was great. And it was attributed an incredible amount of success to the Allied efforts in World War II. So there's that offensive operations. There's also collection and analysis, what we now think of as CIA or State Department's Central Intelligence Agency and State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Those were part of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which was the center point for offensive operations on the part of the US government. And part of that meant you had to get a bunch of information and you had to figure out what it meant, because if you get information on what your adversaries are doing, then you need to be able to exploit it. The third era, which is relatively short, is American global dominance. This is 1991 to maybe the mid 2010s. So for this period of not quite 20 years, the United States was the unipolar and indispensable global power. We had won the Cold War. Countries were down, although not necessarily out. Alliances changed dramatically, but the center of everything, this is obviously a very American-centric view, was that the US was at the center of everything. So there were the existing efforts of investigation and enforcement, because we had to protect what we had, offensive operations, because you know who your adversaries are going to become, collection and analysis, because now there's a big architecture of supporting national security decision-making, but also coordination and policy support, because policymakers wanted to know what the FBI, what the rest of the counterintelligence community knew to guide new statutes, the Economic Espionage Statute of 1996, for example. And there's also greater, not unique, but greater awareness of defensive awareness. The FBI and other organizations have always had outreach and engagement with the private sector, but that really got put on steroids because there was a realization in multiple organizations that the best way to handle the loss of a secret is to not lose it in the first place. So to harden the target. And that kind of captures how we got to where we are in this now fourth era.
Great. So with the fourth era, what is the groundwork for that? Where are we at now with the fourth era?
So this ties back to some of the changing nature of the world of counterintelligence in the last 3 decades. The digitization, the global democratization of information, the speed with which things can be conveyed, the way information and technology can be shared, the way information used to hunt terrorists can be used against intelligence services themselves. That means all of the adversaries have a great more opportunity to become near peer rivals of the United States. So the U.S. is no longer the indispensable. Arguably, the United States is still the indispensable country, but the lead that we had over other countries, including those countries which are adversaries, really became not necessarily vanishingly small, but a lot smaller than we're used to. So the U.S. response has been much of the same of what we have been doing in those first three eras, and a recognition of increased need for defensive awareness. You'll see the outreach and engagement that the FBI's Office of Private Sector, various Air Force Office Special Investigation Programs, National Counterintelligence and Security Center, and the Safeguarding Series. There is a lot more engagement and engagement by other intelligence community members. There's a lot more engagement with the private sector and academia, and a lot more that is disclosed, and a lot more that is multilateral. So it's not one agency and a private sector element, but rather multiple agencies talking to industries writ large, saying this is how the bad guys are after you, this is what you need to safeguard. That is much larger than it ever had been. The problem is the imperative to harden the target and the skill sets and approaches that we use, it hasn't so far scaled well. So our ability to reach out, the U.S. government's ability to reach out and protect everybody who needs protecting, is really challenged, and we don't know what that new paradigm looks like. We do have advantages, to the point that you had raised earlier, Sierra. There are many more people who used to be in the FBI and used to be elsewhere in the IC in the private sector. There is much greater awareness in the private sector of a lot of the analytic skills and tradecraft that people used in government and can now use to protect a corporate or an academic imperative on the private sector and in academia. That didn't exist before, and that's probably going to be the most important benchmark for how we start in this fourth era and move into the future in protecting what we need to protect, not just as a government, but more holistically as an entire society.
I love that. So the gap is shrinking. The targets need to be hardened, but there is a lot of talent in the private sector and incoming to the private sector that has the context awareness and skill sets to organically grow that within companies, as opposed to an external toolbox being sent to the front door of a company saying, figure out how to integrate this. It's happening within through that hiring. So I think that is something really, really positive. But talking about those types of skills and that awareness, what do you see the next generation of counterintelligence professionals, regardless of whether they're going right into government or if they're in the private sector, without any kind of government experience, or that hybrid, individuals that have both? Where do you see those skill sets needing to evolve for the next generation so that we can be successful in this next era?
So I think it's a mix of new and old. I peg 5 skills or characteristics, and I'm sure there are many others, and folks can certainly want to argue the point if they want. I think there's an aspect of digital fluency. Again, I'll point out that I am an old analog geezer, and so technology, my inability to figure out how to do a digital background on a platform that has existed for years, is evidence of this. So how do people make the best use of information? How do they handle vast amounts of information and get to the nugget and tell a story from a haystack that is not made out of a million bits of straw or hay, but rather a million bits of needles, where you actually have to knit together a compelling story? So that digital fluency, how to handle and process massive amounts of information, how are we going to work in an AI infused world? I have been doom scrolling about AI and the good that it can do and the bad that it can do. But the reality is that we have not yet gotten to the point that we understand what AI looks like in the workplace for the kinds of work that we're doing. I think I'm naive enough to think of it as something that can help and give me suggestions and give me thoughts and do some initial script writing. Well, it's much more than that, but we don't know what that looks like. And what does AI mean when it comes to information and disinformation and the ability to suggest things that never actually happened are real? So this broad category of digital fluency is the first category. There's the first skill or characteristic. The second is the willingness to engage with external partners, the private sector, academia, foreign service, which is newish. We've always engaged with the private sector and academia and foreign service. But the idea that we are now in a world in which the adversaries potentially pose a networked threat against us means that we need to provide a networked defense. And that networked offense that the adversaries can bring, they can do this because very often our adversaries are authoritarian states. Well, how do you ensure a network defense when everybody has equal footing in a democracy and everybody has their own equities and everybody has their own cultural traditions, either as a government bureaucracy or a college somewhere where they're looking at academic freedom? So, how do you engage with those partners? And then how do you identify what is the common mission, even the way that I'm talking about it? I don't think that necessarily in the private sector, and certainly not in academia, people don't talk about mission, mission focused, mission driven. They use parallel terms. They mean the same thing, but they don't use the same word. So, how do we establish a lingua franca for that kind of engagement? The third skill or characteristic is old. It's tenacious curiosity. It's all about solving the puzzle. So the people who are really good, for instance, at sophisticated white collar crime or public corruption, that's the same skill set as exists in counterintelligence, different subject matter, but to your earlier point, people coming in and bringing different skills into CI and vice versa. That at the heart of that is people want to solve the puzzle. And I think that that's really important. There is the fourth skill characteristic is comfort with ambiguity. We almost never are going to open a case serial one and close the case serial two. It's always evolving. Things go in different directions. There are questions that we cannot answer. There are secrets that we can get, but then there are mysteries that are unknowable. So when we can thrive in a world of ambiguity, that makes us better because it means that we're not so self-assured that we know the answers to everything. And we always open, in my mind, I always open 10 to 20% that I could be completely wrong, which is part of good analytic tradecraft, regardless if you're following analytic tradecraft, analytic integrity standards, ICD 7203, or if you're actually doing this for good tradecraft for your corporate or your academic job. And the last one, excuse me, is the ability to make the case, not in the legal sense, but if you're an intelligence analyst, it's all about knowledge management. So I always think of it as the triptych of learn it, write it, brief it. So how do you convey that information? And how do you convey that information, which sometimes can be very complicated, to people that aren't necessarily as savvy in understanding the issue? And that's at the heart of what analysts, not just CI analysts, do.
I love those five, and I feel like they repeatedly come up with intelligence analysts in general. To the point you just made now, these are not specific to counterintelligence analysts or the next generation of CI professionals, but definitely inherent to intelligence as a whole and all of the benefactors of having intelligence analysts and intelligence programs within your organization looking for these five characteristics, not even just within the analyst cadre, but more broadly within other job functions and roles. And I think one of the things that resonated with me with what you just said, especially when it comes to AI, is my experience with counterintelligence really opened my eyes to a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with now with misinformation and information operations. And I think CI professionals in particular have early sight and history with questioning information and its validity and why it's appearing when it's appearing. When we're talking about that public-private partnership to combat the threats, to have that common lexicon about threats to critical infrastructure, economic security, and other complex issues, what is, in your mind, if you could wave your wand and say, what is the ideal model for partnership that you envision, that maybe you have seen glimmers of it or really successful models of it in the past?
I wish that I had a one size fits all answer, and I don't. Really, what I think would make for the most effective system, and it would have to be a system as opposed to a singular program, would be meshing together a lot of the efforts in which agencies already engaged, sharing information more effectively, and then scaling it up by including more people in it. So I've seen three things that I think are particularly good. The FBI, for instance, and again, I say this is an FBI partisan, has done things like development of espionage and counterintelligence awareness, DECA, which we had to change the name because there was a record company called DECA. The awareness of national security and information response, answer. The National Security Higher Education Advisory Board and its business counterpart, InfraGard. A lot of the engagement the Office of Private Sector is now engaged in. These things have been going on for decades, but they haven't really been, so that outreach to business and industries and academia has been really important. But they were, to my mind, not core business. Yes, we did them. Yes, they were important. Yes, they got the attention of a lot of high-level FBI executives who made themselves available to C-suite counterparts, CEOs and CFOs and CSOs and CISOs. And you would have an engagement with site security managers and with more folks at the working level out of the individual, what are now the private sector coordinators, the PSCs at field offices. But that wasn't where I say this as if it's present tense. The FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It is not the Federal Bureau of Outreach and Engagement. So how do you take an organization which is fundamentally, which its job is to find and stop the bad guys, to investigate and enforce, and make that into an outreach and engagement shop? So taking those engagement efforts, which the FBI is doing, and the engagement efforts that exist in other organizations are really important. Conferences have been remarkably successful because they're a great way for, particularly in the world of anything touching on matters economic, in the run-up to the Economic Espionage Statute of 1996, when the FBI and other organizations were looking at how do you safeguard economic security, there's a lot of concern about sharing information with the private sector because to avoid the government being seen as giving a tipping hand to one company over another company. So conferences are a great way to democratize that, to engage an entire sector, and they've been really good at raising awareness. FBI, National Counterintelligence Security Center, Office of Air Force, Office of Special Investigations, their external engagement materials have been really good. FBI does a lot of stuff on the cyber front, which is related to counterintelligence. It does a lot of counterintelligence engagement, and CSC has the safeguarding piece. So there's a recognition of tailoring the message to the audience, which is really important. An enduring question I have, and this gets to the issue of how do we scale this, is if you have these small startups that nowadays might be in a tech hub somewhere, and with the CHIPS Act, there are going to be tech hubs in a lot of different places. How do we protect entrepreneurs who are really smart people, who are desperate for venture capital and might not care where that venture capital is coming from and what ties it has, who are very technology savvy, but might not think that they're a target for adversaries to collect their information, especially because it's not classified information, might not have anything to do with national defense at first blush? How do you throw your arms around all of these people? The education campaign, the education efforts, the system of engagement from the very small company to the super large Fortune 50, that's really hard to do because our workforce is generally not trained to engage in those kinds of things. There are many more nodes, again, to your earlier point about the people who've made the transition from government to the private sector academia, there are many more nodes to engage in now than certainly 5 or even 10 years ago, 10 and even 5 years ago, which is great. But we're talking about scaling this well beyond what a lot of the enforcement and investigation components of the counterintelligence community were designed to do. So how do you scale it? How do you have a meaningful, tailored message that is not some blandishment? And that's going to be, I think, an enduring challenge in any engagement outreach effort.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I appreciate that because even just the language that we're using and understanding how counterintelligence might exist within a company is in of itself a language issue. So they might look like insider threat programs, corporate security programs, intelligence programs that are looking to secure what that company is doing, but also as the company embarks in other ventures or sends executives or different facilities overseas, looking at that from a counterintelligence mindset and perspective with the same concerns, but not necessarily calling it intelligence or understanding that people with counterintelligence backgrounds and lessons learned from counterintelligence investigations could be very applicable to those companies. So I think it's very interesting and a big opportunity, not just for private sector companies to come to the government and say, hey, we want to understand this better. We want to understand what we should be looking for, but also the government and government employees leaving for the private sector to be that translation piece and to say, actually, this is already happening in this pockets of the organization, and we can further amplify it by taking these initiatives or taking these steps and kind of unifying around this counterintelligence mission. But I think like where we're at in 2025 is counterintelligence is everywhere. It's a major concern, even if it's not called that. And even if even with people with counterintelligence backgrounds being willing to open and do that expanded counterintelligence mission, that I really like hearing about that. So last question before we close out for today. Where do you see the counterintelligence field in 2050?
So I think that there are going to be probably, I envision at least 4 attributes. I'm sure there are many more, but if we talk about a 5th era and we talk about 2050, I think it's going to be an environment in which AI is ubiquitous, the digitization of everything is ubiquitous, and we have to figure out what that looks like and what the threats look like, or in the private sector consideration, what the risks look like in that kind of world. I also think there's going to be a throwback to human intelligence, because if ubiquitous technical surveillance means that anything that you do digitally can be seen and monitored and you can be surveilled everywhere, I think we're going to see a lot of people who are what we saw with some of the ghost stories. This is the Russian illegal network that got taken down about a decade ago. One of the terms used to describe them was true name illegal. So the Anna Chapman was Anna Chapman. And she wasn't pretending to be who she was. She was that, and she was a spy on the side. So I think we're going to see people engaging in a lot of activity who are exactly what they seem to be, with a double life, but they're going to be trying to keep things out of the digital realm as much as possible. There's also going to be a lot of stuff, digital recruitment, but there's, I think, going to be an emphasis on human, because suddenly if the game becomes all digital, the advantage is in the physical world. I think there's going to be a lot more near-peer adversaries. Countries and non-state actors are going to take advantage of the fact that they can get stuff and they don't have to make nearly the same human capital investment to get it as they had in the past. And that's going to further level the playing field globally. And I think there are going to be, to a point that you raised, the lines between what is the role of government and what is the role of private sector and academia, I think it's going to be a lot more blurred. I think there's going to be a lot more information sharing. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do you establish a trusting relationship where the government is willing to share information, even classified information, with the private sector and academia? And how is the private sector and academia going to share information with the government where it's concerned about the loss of proprietary information or the loss of academic freedom? But I think the blurred lines and the exchanges that happen will be much more intense than they have been in the past.
Great, thank you so much. Well, this has been a really fantastic talk, and I'm just really, really grateful that you joined us today. Is there anything else you want to say to our audience before we close out?
I am grateful to the FBI AIA, which does not roll off the tongue, for the opportunity. The world of counterintelligence is a fascinating one, and it puts the truth in Richard Nixon's statement that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. That said, it is fun to know that there are threats out there, and it's reassuring to know that there are really great people inside and outside of government who want to counter those threats and protect our nation.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And thank you all for joining us, and we will catch you at the next BLUF.